Iran, 1978. On paper, everything looks fine. The economy has been booming for a decade. Tehran has highways, universities, and a modernizing skyline. The Shah is celebrated in Western capitals as a pillar of regional stability, the policeman of the Gulf, and the oil money is flowing. But underneath that surface, something is boiling. The Shah's modernization, his white revolution, has transformed Iran from a rural traditional society into an industrial urban one in the space of about 30 years. That's an extraordinary pace of change, and it left millions of people completely unmoored. Young men poured into Tehran from the countryside, finding no job, no community, and no familiar social structure. Inflation eroded the purchasing power of the middle class and squeezed the merchant class. Clerics watched their traditional authority being mocked and marginalized. And presiding over all of it, a king visibly beholden to Washington, at a time when American cultural influence and political interference were felt by many Iranians as a challenge to their national identity. His secret police force, SVAK, didn't hesitate to use censorship, surveillance, harassment, illegal detention, and torture were common practice. The spark came in January 1978, when a government newspaper published an article mocking Ayatollah Khamenei, a cleric who had been in exile since 1964 for speaking out against the Shah. Students took to the street. Security forces killed some of them, triggering 40-day marches to honor the customary mourning period. As more were killed, more 40-day commemorations followed, a self-reinforcing loop of martyrdom and protest that the Shah had no idea how to stop. It's often forgotten that the 1979 revolution wasn't just an Islamic revolution. It was a broad coalition of Iranian society united against the Shah. Merchants and communists, feminists and clerics, secular nationalists and devout believers, they all hated the Shah for completely different reasons, and Khamenei, operating from exile in Paris, was smart to be vague enough that everyone could project their hopes onto him. And by December 1978, hundreds of thousands were marching in Tehran. The Shah, already secretly dying of cancer, stunned, vacillating between cracking down and making concessions, simply couldn't hold it together. In January, he left Iran on what was officially called a vacation and never came back. On February 1st, Khamenei's plane landed in Tehran after 15 years in exile. Between 3 and 5 million people lined in the streets to welcome him. But what followed wasn't the revolution most of those people had imagined. The liberals were sidelined. The communists were eventually executed by the thousands. Women who had marched against mandatory hijab just weeks after the revolution were told they were counter-revolutionaries. One by one, every partner in the coalition was discarded. What emerged was the Islamic Republic, a state built not on the revolution's aspirations, but on its bones. And that is the foundation of the regime that exists today, born from a stolen revolution, defined from day one by exclusion and coercion. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I had done a video a couple weeks ago about the Iran war launched by the US and Israel, and today I wanted to explore more about what happens before February 28th, 2026. How was Iran faring heading into the conflict? Because Iran had a couple of structural crises that hit the country between 2020 and 2026 that can explain the government's strategic decisions today. This video will look at 4 big aspects: the authoritarian tightening that strangled the regime from within, the collapse of its regional influence, what Iran called its axis of resistance, which was really the crown jewel of its foreign policy, the question of its Russian and Chinese backers, and what the relationship actually looked like, and where Iran stood on the eve of this war. So let's get into it. So to understand what happened to Iran internally, you have to start with the money, because the economic story is generally staggering. In 2016, the rial, Iran's currency, traded at about 34,000 to the US dollar. By 2021, it was at 270,000. By 2022, it was at 430,000. In 2024, it had crossed the 750,000, and then in 2025, it went absolutely off the rails, and by March 2025, it crossed 1 million rails to the dollar, making it briefly the least valuable currency in the world. And by the end of 2025, it was trading at over 1.5 million to the dollar. And the economic hardships were piling up. Iran's own social welfare ministry announced in 2024 that 57% of Iranians were experiencing some level of malnutrition. The parliament reported that half of the men between 25 and 40 were unemployed and not even looking for work. Inflation was running at 43 to 49% in 2025, the fourth highest in the world, behind only Venezuela, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Bread prices nearly doubled. This is the kind of economic deterioration that historically precedes political collapse. The water crisis was just as damning. In 2025, 19 of 31 provinces faced significant drought. Tehran's reservoirs were at 13% capacity. The president himself warned that the capital may need to be relocated. And in surveys, 75% of Iranians blamed mismanagement rather than sanctions or bad luck, pointing to decades of unregulated groundwater extraction and reckless dam construction that state media eventually admitted was the primary cause of shortages. And in addition to all of this, Iran, a country with 10% of the world's proven oil reserves and 15% of its gas, was running low on power for its own people. From February 2025, power was going out nationwide for 3 to 4 hours every day. The industry was seizing up, corporations were pulling out. By December 2025, Time magazine and Al Monitor were describing Iran as nearing economic collapse. A huge portion of this economic catastrophe has a single starting gun: Donald Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Obama had negotiated in 2015. The JCPOA imposed strict, verifiable limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanction relief and reintegration into the international financial system. Iran became the most inspected country in the world. The International Atomic Energy Agency consistently verified it was complying. And for a couple of years, it worked. Foreign investment trickled in, all revenues recovered, the economy breathed. But Trump pulled out in 2018, calling it a terrible deal, and reimposed sanctions targeting Iran's energy, petrochemical, and financial sectors. The sanctions applied not just to American companies, but to any company anywhere in the world doing business with Iran. These are the so-called secondary sanctions. That's the nuclear option in economic warfare. It doesn't just cut off US trade, it effectively forces every company with any exposure to the US financial system to choose between Iran and the US. Unsurprisingly, almost everyone chose the US because of its prevalent place in the economy and access to the dollar. Iran was cut off from the financial international system. Oil revenues collapsed from $67 billion in the fiscal year before Trump's first term to $23 billion in 2021, and the rial went into freefall. Iran tried to hold the deal together for a few years, hoping Europe would compensate, but Europe, despite political will, couldn't effectively defy US secondary sanctions at scale. By mid-2019, Iran began gradually walking back its own commitments, and enrichment levels climbed. By early 2023, Iran had enough enriched material to reach nuclear breakout in about 12 days. And in 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had enough uranium enriched to 60% to fuel 9 weapons once taken to weapons grade. That final step from 60% to the 90% needed for a bomb could be done in as little as 25 days per weapon. The finish line was really close. The Carnegie Endowment, in their obituary for the JCPOA, published in October 2025, put it bluntly. The domestic discourse inside Iran had shifted from why would Iran need a bomb to why hasn't it built one already? That shift from a country integrated into the global economy and under inspection to a cornered state with no real path back to normalcy is a direct consequence of the deal's collapse. And it staged the stage for everything that followed. And this economic downfall also triggered social protests. Most recently, last December and in January of this year, 2026, the Iranian crackdown on the Bazari and young people that took to the street to protest against the government. The regime's response to the protest wasn't unusual for Iran. They've cracked down on protests many times. But what was unusual was who they were targeting. The Bazaris, the merchant class of Iran, are not opposition figures. They are not reformists. They are the social glue. They bankrolled the 1979 revolution. They sustained the regime through the Iran-Iraq war. They have been one of the pillars of the whole system for 46 years. The regime responded to their protests by freezing bank accounts, opening criminal proceedings against dozens of companies, and arresting business figures accused of supporting those strikes and confiscating assets. But by criminalizing economic protest, the regime deepened its rupture with the very social category it historically depended on. And by doing so, it was accelerating its own political isolation at the exact moment, at exactly the wrong moment. What made this worse is that an economic strike is paradoxically harder to crush than a street protest. You can shoot people in the street, you can arrest marchers, but if merchants simply don't open their shops, if commerce stops, there is no single moment of competition to suppress. It's diffuse, persistent, and contagious. And the more the regime cracked down on them, the more it amplified the very economic paralysis driving the original anger. The UN Human Rights Council convened an emergency session in January 2026 to investigate the regime's crackdowns, as casualties reportedly ranged from 7,000 to 36,000 people. And yet, Iran was absent from Davos and rapidly addressed at the Munich Security Conference. These political venues are where quiet compromise is struck, where international respectability is maintained, and being excluded from these signaled marginalization for Iran. But okay, let's now zoom out from the domestic picture to look at the regional one. Iran had built something genuinely impressive over 4 decades, a network of armed non-state partners, so the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias in Iraq, and the Assad regime in Syria, that gave Tehran strategic depth. Instead of fighting its wars on Iranian soil, Iran could project power across the Middle East, keeping pressure on Israel and American interests without formally going to war. This is what Iran called the axis of resistance. For many years, it worked remarkably well. Hezbollah was the crown jewel, with a 100,000 missile arsenal pointed at Israel, a genuine military force, and a political party that had seats in the parliament. Hamas was the pressure valve on Israel's southern border. The Houthis had seized control of Yemen's capital, while holding Saudi Arabia in a grinding, expensive stalemate, and more importantly, could effectively close the Red Sea by attacking ships sailing there. And the Syrian territory was a corridor for weapons and an Iranian foothold in the Mediterranean. By late 2025, most of this was either compromised or in ruins. It started, in a sense, on October 7, 2023. Hamas's attack on Israel triggered a military response that nobody in Iran had fully calibrated for. Israel's campaign on Gaza was extraordinarily destructive, but it also set off a much wider dismantling of Iranian proxies that has to be understood as a coherent strategic project, not just retaliation. And by spring and summer of 2024, Israel was killing Hamas commanders, degrading its tunnel networks, and systematically dismantling its military capacity. Then the Hezbollah escalated on Israel's northern front, but in the fight, the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, arguably the most important figure in Iran's proxy network, a man who had held the organization for 30 years and commanded more military resources than most state armies, was killed in a strike in Beirut in September 2024. And it signaled that Israel was willing to strike targets that had previously been considered too escalatory. The proxy deterrent that Iran has spent decades building was revealing its limits. Then, in December 2024, Bashar al-Assad's government collapsed in Syria. This was a seismic event for Iran. Syria wasn't just a strategic partner, it was a land bridge, the route through which Iran could supply Hezbollah, the territory from which Iran advisors and IRCG commanders operated. The Mediterranean access point that completed Iran's arc from Tehran to Beirut. The Assad relationship was a decade-long strategic investment by Iran and the glue to the whole system. With Assad gone and replaced by forces that were explicitly hostile to Iran's influence, Tehran lost that corridor overnight. The IRCG advisors were withdrawn, the weapon supply routes were severed, and Iran's ability to resupply and reinforce the Hezbollah, already weakened and leaderless, was dramatically curtailed. An Israeli strike on Syrian territory, which had been occurring regularly for years, now faced less resistance. The South Caucasus as well has been a quiet but real erosion of Iran as well as Russian influence. Iran had traditionally leaned towards Armenia, but its inability to provide meaningful support during Azerbaijan's 2020 victory in Nagorno-Karabakh exposed it as an unreliable partner, pushing Yerevan to look westward for security guarantees. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, drifted towards the west as well for its own reasons. Energy diversification deals with Europe, the Middle Corridor trade route deliberately designed to bypass Russia, and a military victory that reduced its dependence on Russia's security guarantees. Then the Houthis. There has been a lot of coverage of the Houthis' attacks on Red Sea shipping, and they were generally effective at causing disruption. They led to hundreds of commercial ships rerouted, massive insurance premium increases, and global shipping delays. And in the end, the Houthis managed to become the most prominent remaining active member of the axis of resistance. But the Houthis, as mighty as they are, can't replace the Hezbollah. Geographically, they are in Yemen, thousands of kilometers from Israel's border and far from Iran's core interests. They are logistically dependent on Iran for weapons, but they're increasingly autonomous actors with their own agenda. A Houthi leader argued that the West is convinced that Ansar Allah obeys Iran, but what if it is the opposite? Iran is their ally, and they sometimes help them and activate them on priority issues, but in no case Iran decide their policy, he said. Basically framing the Houthis as an independent actor with overlapping interests. This claim shows in any case that they do not consider themselves as led by Iran, and there are signs that seem to support this claim. They signed a truce with Saudi Arabia in 2022, seemingly without Iran's approval, and reportedly cut off communication with the Revolutionary Guards for several weeks at the time. Overall, the Houthis are an effective tool of strategic disruption, but can't substitute for Hezbollah as Iran's primary instrument of regional projection. They are too far away, too logistically constrained, and too independent to serve that function. Their prominence is actually a symptom of how much Iran's regional network has deteriorated. They are leading with their weakest hand because they lost their strong ones. In this context came the June 2025 12-day war. By mid-2025, Iran had accumulated enough enriched uranium for 9 nuclear weapons, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the agency board in May 2025, and for the first time since 2005, formally declared Iran non-compliant with its nuclear obligations. The Trump administration had been running negotiations in Oman, but demanding that Iran permanently dismantle its enrichment program, a maximist demand that Tehran couldn't accept without essentially surrendering its nuclear leverage entirely. Then Israel acted. In early June 2025, the Israeli fighter jets attacked dozens of targets across Iran simultaneously, and that included 3 nuclear facilities and several ballistic missile sites, air defense systems, military commanders, and nuclear scientists. Mossad operatives working inside Iran had pre-positioned sabotage operations to complement the airstrikes. It was the most ambitious Israeli military operation since 1976, and it was quite effective. Meanwhile, the US also conducted strikes on the 3 Iranian nuclear facilities under Operation Midnight Hammer. Iran retaliated with nearly 900 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 armed drones. Most were intercepted, but Israel suffered 28 dead. Several dozen Iranian military figures and nuclear scientists were killed in the meantime. And in addition, Iran launched a largely symbolic missile salvo at the US base in Qatar, causing no American casualties, a signal that it wasn't ready to drag the US directly in. After 12 days of fighting, the US brokered a ceasefire that took effect on June 24th. Trump declared it the 12-day war on Truth Social and claimed victory. The Institute for National Security Studies in Israel in December 2025 analysis described the war's impact on Iran as destabilizing, particularly through the damage to its nuclear program and long-range missiles arsenal, while recognizing that short-range ballistic missiles were largely untouched, and Iran had thousands of those. But the assessment was that the medium long-range systems that could hit Israel directly were significantly degraded, and Iran's air defenses were in tatters. In the end, Israel and the US had demonstrated they could operate in Iran's airspace with near impunity. What the 12-day war revealed, according to the ACLED Monitors analysis, was that Israel had been waiting for exactly this kind of window. Iranian proxies weakened, Syrian corridor gone, Hezbollah leaderless, and air defenses compromised. The axis of resistance had gone from being Iran's greatest strategic asset to being its greatest strategic liability. And with its weakness exposed, its deterrent power had failed. By late 2025, Iran was relying heavily on China and Russia. But these two relationships are more nuanced than what they look like in the headlines. The Russia-Iran relationship has real depth. It is built on shared worldviews. Both regimes define themselves in opposition to Western liberal hegemony. Both frame their foreign policies in terms of multipolar world as an euphemism of a world where they can do whatever they want without any accountability. Both have been on the receiving end of massive Western sanctions, and they both operate security states. And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the relationship has also been practically transformative. Iran became Russia's most important weapons supplier, providing shared drones that are now in a large part produced in Russia, but they have been central to Russia's strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. That was a massive strategic service. In return, Russia provided diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, technology transfers, and cooperation in economic warfare and cyber surveillance. In January 2025, just before Trump's second inauguration, Moscow and Tehran signed a new 20-year strategic partnership, a renewal of the agreement that had lapsed in 2021. And Russia has real interest in Iran's survival. The fall of the Assad regime was a serious blow to Moscow's position in the Middle East, and Russia can't afford another partnership collapsing. But Moscow cannot save Iran. Russia can provide diplomatic cover, supply technological assistance for surveillance and internet shutdowns, provide narratives, support against foreign interference, but it can neither absorb the cost of an Iranian economic rescue nor substitute for an agreement with Washington. The Russia-Iran bilateral trade volume sits at about $5 billion a year. Compare that to Russia's $60 billion annual trade with Turkey. It is not a relationship that can sustain an economy. And Russia's economy itself is suffering under multiple sanctions that followed the invasion of Ukraine. There is also an asymmetry that grows more uncomfortable over time. The weaker Iran gets, the more it depends on Russia, and the less it can negotiate an equal partnership. And Russia's credibility has its own limits. It couldn't prevent Israeli strikes, couldn't reverse UN sanctions, can't offer Iran the technological modernization and financial normalization it actually needs to stabilize. China is actually more important to Iran's survival than Russia, but the relationship is even more transactional and, from Iran's perspective, more exposed as insufficient. The numbers are stark. In 2025, China was buying at least 80% of all oil exported by Iran, benefiting from prices discounted by $8 to $10 per barrel compared to market rates because it was essentially laundering sanctioned oil. Iran was selling China oil below cost just to keep the money flowing. But without Chinese purchases, Iran's oil revenues that had already collapsed from their pre-sanction peak would have fallen to near zero. The 2021 25 years cooperation agreement between China and Iran was touted as the foundation of a deep strategic alliance. But the $400 billion investment figure that gets thrown around actually never appeared in any of the official documents. Chinese companies invest when risks are manageable and returns are certain. Iran in 2025 offered political risk at maximum and returns highly uncertain. And so the deal appears to have been largely aspirational. What China actually provides is economic respiration, not transformation. And Beijing's support is explicitly conditional. The moment the US threatens meaningful secondary sanctions against entities buying Iranian oil, China has to calculate whether Iranian oil at a $10 discount is worth a confrontation with the US over technology, trade, and Taiwan. And most likely, China will not go to conflict with Washington to save the Islamic Republic of Iran. The underlying asymmetry is brutal. Iran needs China more than China needs Iran. China can diversify its oil sources, but Iran cannot easily diversify its buyers. China's support is calibrated, reversible, and conditioned, so it's useful as a caution, inefficient as a lifeline. Taken together, this pushed Iran more and more towards the zombie state's trajectory. Not a collapsed state. Iran's institutions still function, its security services still operate, its oil still flows, but the state is increasingly hollowed out. With degraded public services, unable to provide economic growth, stabilize its currency, attract genuine foreign investments, or fund its regional ambitions on its own, and without exhausting its own society. Ideology has also become a multiplier of vulnerability. It prevents the diplomatic compromises that could relieve economic pressure, which makes internal coercion necessary, which further damages Iran's international standing, which deepens the economic crisis, and so on and so forth. Before we get to the conclusion, we need to talk about the one strategic asset that Iran generally retained heading into 2026, the Strait of Hormuz. About 24% of oil and gas traded globally flows through this narrow channel between Iran and Oman. And the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent decades building an asymmetric capability specifically designed to threaten or disrupt that passage, using fast attack boats, shore-based anti-ship missiles, naval mines, surveillance drones, and submarines that are optimized for anti-access and area denial. The goal wasn't to win a naval battle against the US Fifth Fleet. It was to make operating in those waters so dangerous and expensive that any potential adversary would have to think very carefully before escalating. So the Strait of Hormuz definitely played a big role in Iran's deterrence, signaling that even if the adversary is stronger conventionally, if Iran is attacked, Tehran can make the global energy market scream. This approach had been effective historically. During the 2007, 2011, and 2018 Strait of Hormuz crisis, Iran pressure disrupted traffic without triggering a massive military response. The calibration between threat, coercive action, and staying below the threshold of open war is actually quite sophisticated. But threatening to close the strait is much more powerful as a threat than an action. And when Iran actually closes it, it doesn't just hurt the US and Israel, it hurts China, India, Japan, South Korea, and every major Asian economy, every European nation that imports Gulf oil. And the risk is to instantly mobilize a coalition of importers and exporters against Iran that could dwarf any current pressure campaign. Using this nuclear option was always a possibility, but one Tehran refrained from using because of its dire repercussions. Having now deployed this card openly, Iran will find it significantly harder to use again, in my opinion. The element of uncertainty that had made it so powerful as a deterrent has been partially spent, and adversaries will have time to prepare workarounds, alternative routes, and contingency plans. It is also worth highlighting that in the month before February 2026, the US and Iran were technically still talking. Back-channel negotiations in Oman and Geneva had been ongoing since late 2025, with the Trump administration demanding Iran permanently dismantle enrichment program in exchange for partial sanction relief. Tehran's position was essentially a mirror image. It wanted sanction lifted first, with enrichment caps as a subsequent step, a sequencing gap that neither side was willing to bridge. And by 2026, observers had concluded that the talks were a theater. Iran was stalling, the US knew it was stalling, and both the US and Israel were quickly deciding that the diplomacy had run its course. In a way, confirming the famous dictum by Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz that war is a continuation of politics by other means. So as a conclusion, where was Iran on the eve of the 2026 US-Israeli strikes? Economically in freefall. The real at 1.5 million to the dollar, inflation near 50%, GDP growth near zero, the Bazari in open conflict with the state, and the middle class hollowed out by 2 decades of sanctions and mismanagement. Rolling blackouts hitting up to 30 provinces through winter 2024 and 2025, and a water crisis so severe that 19 of its 31 provinces were in significant drought, with the Iranians blaming the government for its mismanagement. Domestically, the regime just had to respond to its deepest economic and social crisis in modern history. Regionally, the axis of resistance was weakened. Assad was gone, the Hezbollah's leadership was degraded, and the Hamas militarily was crippled. The weapons corridor through Syria severed, and the 12-day war had exposed Iran's air defenses as inadequate against strikes. The nuclear program was damaged and under maximum international pressure. Internationally, Iran depended massively on Russia's diplomatic cover and Chinese oil purchases, both of which are genuine but clearly insufficient. Moscow can't economically rescue Iran. Beijing won't go to war for it. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that Beijing also doesn't want to degrade its relationship with other Arab states in the region. So this is the context in which every strategic decision Iran is making right now needs to be read. And in a sense, when we see Tehran using its nuclear option and closing the Strait of Hormuz, that's a country that is really playing its last card. When we see Iran trying to rebuild its missile program, that's a country that saw in June 2025 what happened if you don't have it. And when we see the regime cracking down on protesters during a war, that's a government that knows internal stability is as existential as the external threat of bombardment. Understanding that Iran was entering this conflict from a position of profound weakness, not strength, is essential for understanding what it will and won't do, what it can and cannot afford, and where the fault lines in its decision-making actually lies. It's not the Iran of 2015, flush with anticipation of the nuclear deal's economic dividend. It's not even the Iran of 2019, still capable of orchestrating sophisticated attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure with plausible deniability. This is a cornered regime with nuclear knowledge, a Strait of Hormuz card, and that can still do enormous damage. But it does mean that the strategic logic behind Iranians' decisions is the logic of a government fighting for survival, not projecting power from strength. And that's a very different kind of war. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was informative, and I will see you very soon in the next one.